At 0847 hours on December 26, 1944, Private First Class Marcus Webb crouched behind Sherman Tank No. 32, 2 kilometers southeast of Hotten, Belgium, watching 3 tanks he'd repaired with barbed wire roll toward 9 German Panthers. The temperature was minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Diesel engines strained against the frozen air. Tracks crunched over ground hard as concrete. Through the morning mist, Webb could see the barbed wire wrapped around the final drive housings of the 3 lead Shermans. 7 layers of wire, visible even through mud and snow that caked the hulls. The barbed wire gleamed dully in the weak winter light. It looked primitive. It looked desperate. It looked exactly like what it was. A field expedient repair that violated every regulation in the Army maintenance manual. Webb's hands were shaking. Not from the cold, though the cold was vicious enough to make metal burn bare skin on contact. His hands shook because he knew what came next. If those final drive housings cracked under combat stress, 3 crews would die. 15 men total. 15 men whose survival depended on whether barbed wire could contain cast steel fractures under the worst possible conditions. Sharp turns on frozen ground, high-speed maneuvering, 88mm Panther rounds hammering American armor. If the housings held, Task Force Hogan would break through German encirclement. 14 Shermans would reach American lines. 300 men would survive. If the housings failed, those 3 lead tanks would freeze in place, immobilized, defenseless, and the Germans would kill everyone aboard before recovery vehicles could reach them. Webb had wrapped that barbed wire 36 hours ago. Worked in darkness on Christmas Eve while temperatures dropped to minus 15 degrees. Used German defensive wire salvaged from abandoned positions. Wrapped 7 layers around each cracked final drive housing. Pulled the wire tight with come-alongs until the barbs bit into cast steel. Welded the wire at 12 points per housing to lock the tension. The entire repair violated Army regulations. Unauthorized modification of critical components, use of non-standard materials, failure to follow proper maintenance procedures. Captain Richards had told Webb that if those tanks failed in combat, he'd face court-martial, dishonorable discharge, prison time. But if they worked, Webb would save the 14 Shermans trapped with Task Force Hogan near Marcoret. Would save 300 American soldiers surrounded 32 kilometers behind enemy lines. The barbed wire either held or 17 men died. Webb had 43 minutes to find out which. The M4 Sherman tank had one fatal flaw that was killing American crews faster than German guns. The final drive housing was cast steel, designed for temperate climates, optimized for the North African desert and European summer campaigns. But the Ardennes, winter of 1944, dropped temperatures to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Some nights colder. Cast steel at those temperatures became brittle. The molecular structure of the metal changed. What had been flexible enough to absorb stress in warm weather became rigid and fragile in Belgian winter. When a Sherman made a sharp turn on frozen ground, the final drive housing cracked. The crack propagated through the entire housing in 30 to 90 seconds. The track separated from the drive sprocket. The tank became immobilized, and an immobilized Sherman was a dead Sherman. The failure pattern was consistent and brutal. Sherman commander would call for a hard turn to evade German fire or maneuver for better firing position. The driver would throw the left or right control lever. The tank would begin its turn. Then came the sound. Mechanics who'd heard it said it sounded like a rifle shot. A sharp crack that resonated through the hull. That was the final drive housing fracturing. Within seconds, the crack would propagate vertically through the cast steel. The housing would separate completely. The track would lose connection to the drive sprocket. The tank would lurch to a stop, one track still moving, the other dead. The crew would have perhaps 30 seconds to realize what had happened before German tanks found them. Between December 16th and December 23rd, 1944, the 3rd Armored Division lost 47 Sherman tanks to final drive failures. Not to 88mm rounds, not to Panzerfaust teams, not to mines or mechanical breakdown of other systems. 47 Shermans lost because cast steel housings cracked in Belgian winter. 47 tanks that could have kept fighting. 47 crews that should have survived. The human cost was quantifiable and terrible. Average crew survival time after immobilization was 11 minutes before German fire found them. Panther tanks and German anti-tank guns would spot the disabled Sherman, take firing solutions, and hammer it until the crew was dead or the ammunition cooked off. Recovery vehicle response time was 3 to 6 hours under the best conditions. Most of the time, conditions weren't good. Roads were blocked. Germans controlled key routes. Recovery crews couldn't reach disabled Shermans in time, so the crews died waiting. Died knowing that help was coming, but wouldn't arrive before German shells did. Standard repair procedures made the problem worse. Fixing a cracked final drive housing required removing the entire transmission assembly. 8 hours minimum work time with specialized tools and equipment. The repair needed rear-echelon depot facilities, needed hydraulic lifts to separate the transmission from the hull, needed machine shops to fabricate replacement parts. Frontline mechanics had none of this. They had wrenches, welding torches, and an ever-growing count of dead tankers. They could do nothing except watch good tanks get abandoned because the army couldn't fix them fast enough. The German advantage was overwhelming. Panther tanks hunted disabled Shermans like predators tracking wounded prey. The Panther's 88mm gun could penetrate Sherman frontal armor at 2,000 yards. A frozen Sherman with a cracked final drive housing was target practice. The Germans knew it. They'd learned to recognize the signs of a disabled American tank. The way it sat at an angle, the way one track was motionless while the crew tried desperately to maneuver on the other. Panther commanders would take their time, line up perfect shots, kill the crew methodically, then move on to the next target. Sergeant Thomas Morrison died on December 18, 1944, near Sumray. He was 31 years old, from Cleveland, Ohio, with 2 years of combat experience. He was a good tank commander. Careful, professional, the kind of sergeant who brought his crew home alive. On the afternoon of December 18th, Morrison's Sherman was maneuvering to avoid a German anti-tank gun position. The temperature was minus 13 degrees. Morrison called for a hard left turn. His driver executed. The final drive housing cracked with a sound like a rifle shot. The left track separated. The Sherman stopped in an open field with no cover and no way to move. 2 Panther tanks were 800 yards away. They had perfect firing solutions. Morrison's final radio transmission lasted 6 seconds. Final drive's gone. We're stuck. Can't move, can't. Then the first 88mm round hit. It penetrated the turret. The second round ignited the ammunition stored inside. The third round was unnecessary, but the Panther gunner fired it anyway. Morrison's Sherman burned for 40 minutes before the flames died down enough for anyone to approach. Webb's maintenance unit reached Morrison's tank 4 hours later. They found 5 bodies. They found the cracked final drive housing, fractured completely through, exactly as every other failure had looked. They found nothing they could have done to prevent it. The housing had failed because cast steel couldn't handle Belgian winter stress. The crew had died because the Army had no field expedient repair for the problem. Morrison had been friendly to Webb, had defended him when officers criticized his improvised repairs, had said, "Kid fixes things that need fixing. That matters more than regulations." Now Morrison was dead, and Webb understood something clearly. Good commanders were dying because cast steel couldn't handle Belgian winter, and nobody was fixing the problem. Regulations said wait for depot facilities. Reality said men died while waiting. Marcus Webb was 17 years old. He'd lied on his enlistment papers, claimed he was 18 when he signed up in June 1943. He was 5 feet 9 inches tall, weighed 140 pounds, and had perpetually greasy hands that no amount of washing ever done completely cleaned. He spoke with a Tennessee drawl that marked him as country, even among other country boys in the 3rd Armored Division. He'd grown up in Crossville, Tennessee, a town with a population of 2,300, where everybody knew everybody and most people made their living from farming or the timber industry. Webb's father owned Webb's Garage on Main Street. Marcus had been fixing tractors, trucks, and farm equipment since age 11. His father taught him that expensive machines and cheap machines broke the same way. A $5,000 tractor and a $500 tractor both had engines that overheated, transmissions that failed, and parts that wore out. The manual said one thing. Reality said another. His father taught him to trust reality. The best repair was the one that worked, not the one that looked pretty in a technical diagram. Webb had lied about his age because he wanted to fight, wanted to do something that mattered. The Army took one look at his enlistment papers, saw that he'd listed his father's occupation as mechanic, and assigned Webb to maintenance. He was disappointed at first, wanted to be a tanker or infantry. Then he realized that maintenance kept men alive. A tank that ran was a tank that fought. A tank that fought was a tank that brought its crew home. So Webb learned to fix Shermans the same way he'd learned to fix tractors, with practicality instead of theory, with improvisation instead of regulation. He landed in France in August 1944, assigned to 3rd Armored Division Maintenance Company. His first impression of Army regulations was immediate and negative. Too many rules. Not enough solutions. The Army had a procedure for everything, and most procedures seemed designed to prevent mechanics from actually fixing things. Want to replace a broken part? File a requisition. Wait 3 weeks for approval. Wait another 2 weeks for shipment. Meanwhile, the tank sat deadlined and the crew sat idle. Webb had been written up twice for unauthorized repairs. In September 1944, he'd used fence wire to secure a loose engine mount on a Sherman belonging to Lieutenant Paul Drexler. Regulation required requisitioning a proper mounting bracket. Estimated wait time, 3 weeks. Webb wrapped fence wire around the mount in a figure-8 pattern, created tension reinforcement, and had the tank operational in 22 minutes. The tank kept fighting from France into Belgium. Captain Richards wrote Webb up for unauthorized modification and threatened Article 15 disciplinary action. Drexler defended Webb, said the kid had saved his tank, said regulations could wait until they weren't being shot at. In November 1944, Webb fabricated a replacement oil pump gear from scrap metal instead of waiting for parts shipment. The gear had stripped teeth. Standard procedures said, order a replacement. Estimated delivery, 6 to 8 weeks. Webb found a wrecked German Panzer IV, pulled a gear from its oil pump, recut the teeth using a hand file and the drill press from his maintenance truck. Took him 11 hours. The gear fit perfectly. The Sherman was operational within 12 hours instead of 8 weeks. Sergeant Kowalski threatened court-martial, said you can't put German parts in American tanks. Webb said it was steel with teeth, didn't speak German. The tank commander intervened, said his crew lived because of that gear. Both times, the tanks kept fighting. Both times, Webb's sergeants threatened court-martial. Webb's philosophy was simple. They could court-martial him after the war ended. But they couldn't win the war with broken tanks. Fixing things mattered more than following regulations that prevented things from getting fixed. On December 24, 1944, Webb faced his biggest test. Task Force Hogan was surrounded near Marcoret, 32 kilometers behind German lines. They had 14 Sherman tanks. 3 had cracked final drive housings. Command decision was clear. Abandon the 3 disabled tanks. Destroy them in place. Don't let the Germans capture them. Standard procedure. Logical procedure. But Webb looked at those 3 tanks differently. He saw 3 working tanks if someone would fix the final drives. 3 crews who could fight instead of die. Enough firepower to break the encirclement if those tanks could move. His sergeant's order was explicit. Leave them. That's final. Webb responded exactly as regulations required. Yes, Sergeant. Then he waited until dark. Because sometimes the right answer wasn't following orders. Sometimes the right answer was fixing what needed fixing and accepting the consequences later. Webb stared at the cracked final drive housing on Sherman No. 17 in the fading light of December 24th evening. The temperature was minus 14 degrees. His breath frosted in the air. The crack ran vertically through the cast steel, 17 inches long, maybe 1/8 of an inch wide at the widest point. Standard repair said this was impossible to fix in the field. But Webb had seen this problem before, not on a Sherman, on a John Deere tractor in the summer of 1941. He was 14 years old that summer. A farmer from outside Crossville had brought in a tractor with a cracked transmission housing. Webb's father looked at it, told the farmer it would cost $200 to replace the entire transmission. The farmer didn't have $200, said he'd have to make do without the tractor. Webb's father shrugged, said there was nothing else to be done. But Marcus looked at that crack differently. He saw the same thing he was seeing now in Belgium 3 years later. The crack propagated because nothing stopped it. The housing had no reinforcement. Once the fracture started, physics took over. The crack spread through the weakest path in the metal until the entire housing failed. Webb wrapped baling wire around that transmission housing. 14 loops of wire pulled tight with a come-along. The wire created compression reinforcement. It contained the crack, stopped it from propagating. The tractor worked for 3 more years on that repair. When Webb's father saw what he'd done, he said, "That's not in the manual." Webb replied, "Manual doesn't fix things. Wire does." His father had laughed, told him he was too smart for his own good, but let the repair stand. The farmer got his tractor back for the cost of 30 minutes of labor and some scrap wire. That summer, Webb learned other improvised repairs his father had developed over years of practical work, using chain to reinforce cracked engine blocks, wrapping the chain tight around the crack, welding it in place, letting the chain's tension prevent further propagation, fabricating gaskets from boot leather when proper gasket material wasn't available, using barbed wire to secure loose components. The barbs created friction against metal surfaces. They prevented slippage better than smooth wire. These weren't repairs you'd find in any manual. These were repairs that worked when manuals failed. The principle was always the same. Contain the failure. Don't replace the component. Make the component stronger than its weakness. A cracked housing didn't need complete replacement if you could prevent the crack from spreading. Compression reinforcement did that. It was basic engineering. The kind of engineering you learned fixing tractors in Tennessee, not the kind they taught in Army schools. And now, staring at that Sherman final drive housing in Belgium, Webb understood. A Sherman final drive housing was just a bigger tractor transmission. Same problem, same solution, different scale. Webb had already proven he could fix things the Army said were unfixable. In September 1944, Lieutenant Paul Drexler's Sherman developed a cracked engine mount. The mount held the engine to the tank's frame. When it cracked, the engine vibrated loose. Standard procedure said requisition a replacement mounting bracket. Estimated arrival time was 3 weeks. Drexler's tank would sit deadline for 3 weeks while paperwork moved through supply channels. Webb had a different solution. He salvaged fence wire from a French farm, wrapped it around the engine mount in a figure-8 pattern. The wire created tension reinforcement. It held the cracked mount together and dampened the engine vibration. Installation took 22 minutes. The engine held. The tank fought through France and into Belgium without the mount failing again. Captain Richards wrote Webb up for unauthorized modification. Threatened Article 15 disciplinary action. Drexler defended Webb, told Richards that kids saved his tank, said regulations could wait until they weren't being shot at. Richards backed, but warned Webb directly. Next time, you're done. There was a next time, November 1944. An oiled-on, pump drive gear stripped its teeth in one of the Shermans. Without that gear, the pump couldn't maintain oil pressure. Without oil pressure, the engine would seize. Standard procedures said, order a replacement part. Estimated delivery time was 6 to 8 weeks from the depot in England. The Sherman would sit useless for 2 months, while the Army shipped a gear that probably weighed 2 pounds. Webb found a wrecked German Panzer IV near their position. He crawled inside, found the oil pump, removed the drive gear. The Panzer gear had similar diameter to the Sherman gear, but different tooth count. Webb took it back to his maintenance truck, used a hand file and the drill press to recut the teeth. Took him 11 hours of careful work. The modified gear fit perfectly. The Sherman was operational within 12 hours instead of 8 weeks. Sergeant Kowalski saw the repair and immediately called Webb to account. "You can't put German parts in American tanks. That's sabotage." Webb looked at him calmly. "It's steel with teeth. Doesn't speak German." Captain Richards threatened court-martial, called it treason to use enemy materials. But the tank commander intervened, told Richards his crew lived because of that gear. Said if Richards touched Webb, he'd answer for it. Richards relented, but delivered a final warning. "One more violation, just one. You're finished." Webb's reputation grew despite official disapproval. Tank crews started requesting him specifically for repairs. They knew Webb could fix things other mechanics wouldn't even attempt. Other mechanics resented him. He made them look slow and by the book. Officers didn't know what to do with him. He was effective but insubordinate. Saved tanks and crews, but violated regulations constantly. Webb didn't care about his reputation among mechanics or officers. He cared about tanks running and crews surviving. Everything else was noise. On December 24th, Webb faced the situation that would define his war. Task Force Hogan was surrounded near Marcoret, 32 kilometers behind enemy lines. The task force was led by Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Hogan, a capable commander who'd pushed deep into German territory on December 21st during the initial American response to the Ardennes Offensive. But the Germans counterattacked faster than anyone anticipated. They cut Task Force Hogan off from the main American lines. Now Hogan commanded 14 Sherman tanks, 300 infantry, and various supporting vehicles, all trapped in a perimeter around Marcoret with no resupply, low ammunition, and wounded men piling up in the aid station. They had radio contact with Allied headquarters, but no relief force was coming. They'd have to break out on their own. 3 of Hogan's 14 Shermans were disabled with cracked final drive housings. Tank number 17, commanded by Sergeant Davis, had cracked its final drive during a defensive maneuver on December 23rd. Tank number 23, commanded by Lieutenant Barnes, cracked its housing during the retreat to the Marcourès perimeter. Tank number 32, commanded by Sergeant Paulson, failed during defensive positioning on the morning of December 24th. All three tanks were otherwise operational. Engines ran, guns worked, crews were intact. But without functioning final drives, the tanks couldn't move. And tanks that couldn't move were worse than useless. They were targets. At 1600 hours on December 24th, Colonel Hogan held a command meeting. His assessment was clear. We can't take disabled tanks when we break out. Destroy them. The tank commanders protested immediately. Davis, Barnes, and Paulson stood together. Those are good tanks. Just need the final drives fixed. Captain Richards cut them off. Final drive replacement requires depot facilities. 8 hours minimum work time. We don't have 8 hours. We don't have the tools. We don't have the parts. The tanks are deadlined. Webb stood in the back of the meeting, listening. He'd already examined all three tanks that afternoon. He knew what the problem was. More importantly, he knew how to fix it. But stating that opinion in a command meeting would accomplish nothing except getting him ordered not to attempt repairs. So Webb stayed silent, listened, learned that Colonel Hogan planned to destroy the 3 disabled Shermans in place rather than let the Germans capture them. Learned that the breakout was scheduled for December 26th at 0800 hours. Learned he had approximately 36 hours to do something nobody expected. At 1700 hours, Webb crawled under all 3 disabled Shermans. Daylight was fading. Temperature was -14 degrees. His hands went numb within minutes, despite the gloves he wore. Each tank had a similar crack pattern. Vertical fracture lines starting at the bottom stress point where the housing bolted to the frame. The crack propagated upward toward the top of the housing. None of the cracks had completely separated the housings yet. But they would. Any hard maneuvering would finish the job. Sharp turns, high-speed reversals, combat stress. The cracks would propagate completely and the tracks would separate. The cracks needed compression reinforcement. Needed something wrapped around the housings to prevent further fracture propagation. Standard steel banding would work perfectly, but they had no steel banding. Webb looked around the frozen Belgian landscape, thinking about materials. Then he saw it. German barbed wire. The Wehrmacht had strung hundreds of yards of defensive wire across the fields around Marcourès before Task Force Hogan captured the position. The wire was still there, abandoned, considered useless. Webb analyzed the barbed wire the way he'd learned to analyze any material. It was high-tensile steel, designed to hold tension without stretching or breaking. The barbs would bite into the cast steel of the final drive housings. They'd prevent slippage better than smooth wire. Multiple layers would create compression reinforcement around the entire housing. If he could wrap it tight enough, pull it with come-alongs to maintain constant tension, and weld it at key points to lock everything in place, the wire might contain the cracks, might prevent them from propagating during combat maneuvering, might save 3 tanks and 15 men. Might. Not definitely. Might. But might work was infinitely better than definitely abandoned. Webb faced an internal conflict that came down to simple arithmetic. Sergeant Kowalski had explicitly ordered him not to touch the disabled tanks. Captain Richards had threatened court-martial for one more unauthorized repair. Army regulations clearly stated that final drive repairs required depot facilities with specialized equipment. But those same regulations also said abandon 3 working tanks because the Army couldn't fix them fast enough. 3 tanks equaled 3 crews, approximately 15 men. 15 men who would die if the Germans overran the mark-array position during the inevitable assault. 15 men who might survive if they could fight their way out with the rest of Task Force Hogan. Webb figured he'd probably face court-martial eventually anyway. His track record made that inevitable. Better to be court-martialed with 15 men alive than follow regulations and watch 15 men die. The logic was clear even if the consequences were severe. At 2000 hours, Webb found Private Eddie Sanchez. Sanchez was a fellow mechanic from Texas, competent and willing to bend rules when circumstances demanded it. He'd covered for Webb during previous unauthorized repairs. Webb approached him directly. "I'm fixing those 3 tanks tonight. I'm probably getting court-martialed. You in?" Sanchez looked at the disabled Shermans, looked at Webb. "How are you fixing them?" Webb answered with 2 words. "Barbed wire." Sanchez stared at him for 5 seconds. "You're insane. When do we start?" They waited until 2100 hours. Full darkness. Temperatures dropped to -15 degrees. Webb and Sanchez crawled 200 yards across frozen ground to the German barbed wire defensive line. The wire was still strung on posts, exactly as the Wehrmacht engineers had positioned it before retreating. Webb used bolt cutters to cut approximately 400 yards of wire. The wire fought back. It was designed to resist cutting. Each strand took effort to sever. Sanchez worked beside him. After 30 minutes, Sanchez said, "Germans strung this wire. We're using it to fix American tanks. That's poetic." Webb kept cutting. "That's practical. Let's move." They dragged the wire back to the maintenance area, positioned come-alongs near each disabled Sherman. Come-alongs were hand-operated cable pullers. Turn the ratchet handle and the cable pulled with tremendous force. Perfect for tensioning wire, Webb gathered his welding equipment. The portable oxyacetylene torch setup. Wrenches, pry bars, wire cutters, welding rod. Everything he needed to wrap barbed wire around cast steel housings and make it hold. At 21:45 hours on December 24th, 1944, Webb started with tank number 17, Sergeant Davis's Sherman. Temperature was -15 degrees. Wind blew 12 miles per hour from the northeast. Webb's hands were already numb. He had 3 tanks to repair and maybe 6 hours before someone noticed what he was doing. The work began. At 21:45 hours, Webb crawled under Sherman tank number 17 with a flashlight clenched between his teeth. The final drive housing crack measured 17 inches long, roughly 1/8 of an inch wide at the widest point. The crack pattern was textbook stress failure. Started at the bottom stress concentration point where the housing bolted to the tank's frame, propagated upward toward the mounting bolts. The housing was brutally cold. Cast steel at -15 degrees Fahrenheit. Touch it wrong and skin stuck to metal. Webb traced the crack with his finger, felt the separation in the steel. The housing would fail completely within the first hard maneuver. Maybe the second, if the crew was lucky. But definitely fail. The first step was cleaning the surface. Webb used a wire brush to scrub away mud, ice, and grease from the housing. The surface had to be clean for the barbed wire to grip properly. If the wire slipped even slightly, the compression reinforcement wouldn't work. Sanchez held the flashlight while Webb worked. 18 minutes of scrubbing in -15-degree cold. Webb's hands bled from a combination of cold and wire brush friction. He didn't care. The housing had to be clean. Webb started wrapping the first layer of barbed wire at the bottom of the housing, worked upward. He wrapped the wire around the circumference of the housing, while Sanchez pulled it tight with the come-along. The barbs bit into the cast steel, created hundreds of small grip points that prevented the wire from sliding. Each revolution around the housing required 3 minutes to position correctly. The wire had to follow the contour of the housing. Had to maintain even tension. Had to be tight enough to create compression reinforcement, but not so tight it might crack the already damaged housing further. The first layer consisted of 7 complete wraps around the housing. Sanchez operated the come-along while Webb guided the wire. Tension had to be perfect. Too loose, and it wouldn't contain the crack. Too tight, and it might propagate the fracture. The subsequent layers followed a deliberate pattern. Layer 2 offset from the first layer by 45 degrees. This distributed the compression forces more evenly. Layer 3 returned to the original alignment directly over Layer 1. Layers 4 through 7 alternated the pattern. Each layer increased the power. Compression reinforcement. The barbed wire created overlapping steel cages around the final drive housing. By the time Webb finished the 7th layer, he'd used approximately 130 feet of wire on this single housing. The crack was now contained within 7 layers of high-tensile wire under constant compression. Physics said the crack couldn't propagate through that much steel under tension. Webb trusted physics more than he trusted Army regulations. The welding was the most dangerous part. Webb marked 12 positions around the housing circumference, equal spacing. He welded the wire to the housing at each point using the oxyacetylene torch. The welds had to be quick. Too much heat would compromise the cast steel's crystal structure. Could create thermal stress that might actually crack the housing worse than the original damage. Each weld lasted 3 seconds. 3 seconds of torch flame, just enough to fuse wire to housing. Welding at -15 degrees was particularly dangerous. Metal contracted rapidly when it cooled. Rapid contraction could crack from thermal shock. Webb worked fast, precise, no wasted motion. Total welding time was 8 minutes for all 12 points. When he finished, Webb pulled on the barbed wire to test it. Checked the tension, checked each weld. Everything held solid. Sanchez asked, "Think it'll hold?" Webb answered honestly, "Don't know. Never done this before." Sanchez said, "That's comforting." Webb pulled harder on the wire. "It's compression reinforcement. Same principle as barrel bands on old naval cannons. Should work." Sanchez caught the qualifier. "Should?" Webb looked at the repair in the flashlight beam. 7 layers of barbed wire wrapped around cracked cast steel. "We find out tomorrow." Tank number 17 took 42 minutes from start to finish. Webb started at 21:45 hours. Finished at 22:27 hours. 2 more tanks to go. Tank number 23, Lieutenant Barnes's Sherman, started at 22:30 hours. The crack pattern was similar to the first tank. Vertical fracture, bottom to top, same stress points. But Webb worked faster now. He knew the process, knew how the wire wrapped, knew how tight to pull before the barbs bit properly. Sanchez anticipated each step. They moved like a surgical team. No wasted communication. Webb would reach for a tool, and Sanchez would already be handing it to him. The come-along ratcheted. The wire tightened. The torch flared for 3-second welds, completed at 23:09 hours, 39 minutes total. Tank number 32, Sergeant Paulson's Sherman, started at 23:12 hours. This crack was worse, 22 inches long with wider separation than the other 2 tanks. Webb made an immediate decision. He doubled the first layer, 14 wraps instead of 7. Used extra wire to reinforce the section where the crack was widest. Welded 16 points instead of 12. Repair took longer, but the damage demanded it. Sanchez watched Webb work and said, "If this one holds, it's a miracle." Webb didn't look up from the welding. Miracles are just engineering nobody's thought of yet. Completed at 23:55 hours, 43 minutes, 3 tanks repaired. Total time, 2 hours and 10 minutes. Total wire used, approximately 400 feet of German barbed wire. Total welds. 40 spots across 3 final drive housings. Total regulations violated. Webb stopped counting after 7. He and Sanchez stood in the snow looking at 3 Sherman tanks wrapped in barbed wire. The wire gleamed under moonlight, looked primitive, looked desperate, looked like exactly what it was. Field expedient repair using salvaged enemy materials. Sanchez said, "They look like they're wearing barbed wire armor." Webb studied his work. "They kind of are." They cleaned up the evidence, hid the come-alongs in the maintenance truck, scattered the remaining wire so it looked like wind-blown debris instead of deliberate salvage, wiped down the tools. By the time they finished, it was 00:15 hours on December 25th. Christmas morning in Belgium. Temperature had dropped to -16 degrees. Webb and Sanchez returned to the maintenance area and tried to sleep. Sanchez managed. Webb couldn't. He kept thinking about those 3 final drive housings, kept seeing Sergeant Morrison's Sherman burning with 5 men trapped inside, kept wondering if the barbed wire would hold under combat stress or if he'd just killed 15 men with unauthorized repairs that would fail at the worst possible moment. At 07:20 hours on Christmas morning, Sergeant Kowalski discovered the repairs during his routine inspection. He found Webb in the maintenance tent cleaning tools. Kowalski asked directly, "Did you touch those disabled tanks?" Webb answered, "Yes, Sergeant." Kowalski's voice got quiet. "After I explicitly ordered you not to?" Webb maintained eye contact. "Yes, Sergeant." Kowalski asked, "What did you do to them?" Webb explained in the same tone he'd used to describe routine maintenance. "Fixed the final drive housings, used barbed wire for compression reinforcement. They'll hold." Kowalski walked to the 3 Shermans without another word, crawled under each one, examined the barbed wire wrapping, checked the welds, ran his hands over the wire to feel the tension, spent 5 minutes under each tank. Then he came back to Webb. Kowalski said, "This is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen." Webb waited for the court-martial threat, the arrest, the end of his Army career. Instead, Kowalski said, "It might actually work." Webb felt something loosen in his chest. "It will work, Sergeant." Kowalski shook his head. "You don't know that." Webb replied, "I know cast steel. I know compression reinforcement. I know it'll work." Captain Richards arrived 20 minutes later. Someone had told him about the unauthorized repairs. He found Webb and Kowalski standing beside the Shermans. Richards's voice was cold. "Private Webb, you were ordered not to touch these tanks." Webb stood at attention. "Yes, sir." Richards continued, "You understand this is a court-martial offense?" Webb answered, "Yes, sir." Richards gestured at the tanks. "These tanks are still deadlined, still combat ineffective." Webb disagreed respectfully. "No, sir. They're combat ready." Richards demanded, "Based on what assessment?" Webb replied, "Based on my assessment, sir. The barbed wire will hold." Richards examined the repairs himself, looked at the barbed wire, looked at the welds. His expression showed nothing. Finally, he spoke. "This is unauthorized, untested, dangerous." Webb kept his voice level. "Sitting here waiting to die is also dangerous, sir." Richard stepped closer. "If these tanks fail in combat, you're responsible. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, prison." Webb nodded. "If they work, we save 15 men." Richard said, "That's not your decision to make?" Webb met his eyes. "Someone had to make it, sir." Colonel Hogan had been listening from 30 feet away. He walked to the group, examined the repairs without speaking, crawled under one Sherman, then another, stood up and brushed snow from his uniform. Hogan asked, "Captain Richards, status of these 3 tanks?" Richards answered formally, Deadlines, sir. Unauthorized repairs, untested in combat. Hogan looked at Webb directly. Will they hold, son? Webb answered without hesitation. Yes, sir. Hogan nodded once. Good enough. We break out at 0800 hours tomorrow. These 3 tanks lead. Richards protested. Sir, if they fail, Hogan cut him off. Then we're no worse off than if we abandon them. But if they work, we have 3 more tanks. We need every gun we've got. He turned to Webb. If those tanks fail, you answer to me. Understood? Webb said, Yes, sir. Hogan dismissed everyone with a gesture. The meeting was over. Webb's repairs would be tested in combat. Webb couldn't sleep Christmas night. At 0530 hours on December 26th, he walked to the 3 repaired Shermans in darkness, checked each barbed wire wrap, checked each weld. Everything held. Everything looked solid. But he understood the difference between holding stationary and holding under combat stress. Sharp turns at speed, reverse maneuvers, impacts from rough terrain, 88mm rounds hitting nearby and transmitting shock through the suspension. Static testing proved nothing. Only combat would prove whether the repairs worked. At 0600 hours, the tank crews gathered around Webb. Sergeant Davis, Lieutenant Barnes, and Sergeant Paulson. 3 commanders whose lives depended on barbed wire wrapped around cracked housings. Webb explained the repairs as honestly as he could. The barbed wire creates compression reinforcement, keeps the cracks from propagating, should hold under normal maneuvering. Davis caught the qualifier immediately. Should? Webb nodded. I've never tested it in combat, but the engineering's sound. Barnes said, You're 17 years old. What do you know about engineering? Webb answered, I know how to fix things, sir. That's the engineering that matters. Paulson studied the barbed wire visible under his tank. If my final drive fails and gets my crew killed, I'm coming back to haunt you. Webb said, Fair enough, Sergeant. At 0700 hours, Webb did one final inspection. Crawled under each Sherman. The barbed wire was tight. The welds were solid. The temperature had warmed to -9 degrees. Relatively warm for Belgian December. Better conditions than when he'd done the repairs. Sanchez appeared beside him. Think they'll hold? Webb pulled himself out from under the last Sherman. Yeah, I think so. Sanchez said, That's not certainty. Webb wiped grease from his hands. Nothing's certain in war, but I'm certain I did everything right. At 0800 hours, Task Force Hogan formed up in column. 14 Sherman tanks in formation. The 3 barbed wire tanks in lead positions. Behind them, 11 other Shermans. Behind them, infantry and half-tracks and support vehicles. The plan was simple. Smash through the German encirclement. Reach American lines 12 kilometers south. Expected resistance was heavy. Intelligence reported German armor in the area. Possibly Panther tanks. Possibly Panzer IVs. Definitely anti-tank guns and Panzerfaust teams. Webb stood beside the maintenance truck watching the column prepare to move. His 3 repaired Shermans sat at the front, wrapped in barbed wire, looking like desperate improvisation, which is exactly what they were. The engines rumbled to life. Exhaust smoke rose in the frozen air. In 47 minutes, those 3 tanks would meet 9 German Panthers in combat. And Webb would learn whether physics and barbed wire could beat cast steel and Belgian winter. At 0815 hours on December 26, 1944, Task Force Hogan rolled south toward American lines. The 3 barbed wire Shermans led the column. Webb stood beside the maintenance truck and watched them disappear into the frozen Belgian forest. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, though the temperature was still -9 degrees. His hands shook because he knew that 15 lives depended on barbed wire he'd wrapped in darkness 2 nights ago. Depended on whether compression reinforcement theory translated to combat reality. Depended on whether a 17-year-old mechanic from Tennessee understood cast steel better than Army engineers. At 0843 hours, 2 kilometers from Marcourès, the column encountered first resistance. German small arms fire. Panzerfaust teams positioned in tree lines. The Shermans rolled through without slowing. Webb listened on the radio frequency. Tank commanders calling out targets. Machine guns engaging infantry positions. Then Sergeant Davis's voice came through clearly. "Final drives holding. No vibration. No cracking sounds." Webb exhaled for the first time in 28 minutes. The final drives were holding under movement stress. First test passed. At 0847 hours, the forward observer radioed Colonel Hogan with a contact report that changed everything. Armor contact. 9, repeat 9, Panther tanks, defensive positions around Houghton Crossroads. Hogan's response was immediate. "Can we go around?" The observer answered, "Negative. They're blocking the only road south. We go through them, or we don't go." Hogan keyed the command frequency. "All Shermans, prepare for engagement. Acknowledge." 14 Sherman commanders acknowledged in sequence. Webb heard Davis, Barnes, and Paulson among them. His 3 repaired tanks were about to face 9 German Panther tanks in direct combat. The tactical situation was nightmare mathematics. The Panther mounted an 88mm gun. The Sherman mounted a 75mm gun. The Panther's frontal armor was 80mm of sloped steel. The Sherman's frontal armor was 51mm. In a straight fight at any range, Panthers won every time. American tank crews knew this, had known it since Normandy. The Panther could kill a Sherman from 2,000 yards. The Sherman needed to close to 800 yards and hit the Panther's side or rear armor. Frontal penetration was nearly impossible unless you got extremely lucky or extremely close. But this wouldn't be a straight fight. 9 Panthers sat in defensive hull-down positions. Their frontal armor was nearly impenetrable to Sherman guns, but they were stationary, positioned for ambush. Task Force Hogan was moving, had initiative, had momentum. Colonel Hogan's plan was simple and brutal. 3 lead Shermans would draw Panther fire. The other 11 Shermans would split left, and right. Flank the German positions. Catch the Panthers from the sides, where their armor was weaker. American doctrine when facing German heavy armor. Avoid frontal engagements, get side shots, kill them from angles they can't defend. Everything depended on the 3 lead tanks surviving long enough to let the others execute the flanking maneuver. Everything depended on Davis, Barnes, and Paulson keeping their Shermans mobile under Panther fire. Everything depended on barbed wire holding under combat stress. The Panthers opened fire at 0851 hours. Range was 1,200 yards. 88mm rounds screamed downrange with flat trajectories and devastating velocity. The first round hit dirt 10 feet in front of Davis's Sherman. Through frozen earth 30 feet into the air. The second round hit Barnes's tank. Struck the frontal armor at an angle, glanced off without penetrating. Paulson's Sherman took a hit on the turret side. The round deflected upward, left a deep gouge in the armor, but didn't penetrate. All 3 barbed wire Shermans kept moving. Webb, listening on the radio back at the maintenance position, heard the impacts. Heard the commanders calling out hits. His hands gripped the radio so hard, his knuckles went white. "They're taking fire. They're still moving." At 0852 hours came the moment Webb had been dreading. Davis, Barnes, and Paulson executed sharp evasive turns, hard maneuvers to spoil the Panther gunners' aim. This was maximum stress on the final drive housings. Sharp turns on frozen ground. exactly the conditions that had been cracking housings and killing crews all month. Webb held his breath, waited for the radio calls he'd been hearing since December. Final drive failure, we're immobilized. The calls didn't come. Instead, Davis's voice. Still mobile, final drive holding. Barnes reported seconds later. No cracks, no vibrations. Paulson's transmission contained something Webb had never heard in a combat report. Relief. This barbed wire's working. Whatever the kid did, it's working. While the 3 barbed wire Shermans absorbed Panther attention at 0854 hours, the other 11 Shermans executed Hogan's flanking maneuver. 6 tanks moved left, 5 moved right. The Panthers were focused forward on the 3 lead tanks. Didn't see the flankers until too late. This was standard American doctrine against German heavy armor. You couldn't penetrate Panther frontal armor with a 75mm gun. But you could penetrate their side armor, 50mm of vertical steel, no slope. The Sherman's gun could punch through that at 800 yards. The first Panther died at 0856 hours. A Sherman from the left flank got a perfect side shot on the lead German tank, 800 yards. The 75mm round penetrated the side armor. The Panther exploded. Ammunition cooked off inside. The turret lifted 6 feet off the hull and crashed down at an angle. 1 down, 8 remaining. Between 0857 and 0902 hours, the engagement became chaos. The kind of chaos that tanks created when fighting at close range in confined terrain. The Panthers tried to reposition, tried to defend against the flanking Shermans. But repositioning exposed them to the 3 lead tanks. Davis got a shot on a Panther that was turning to face the left flankers. Hit it in the turret ring, where the turret mounted to the hull, the weakest point on any tank. The Panther's turret jammed. The tank was disabled. Crew bailed out. 2 down. Barnes engaged a Panther at 600 yards, fired 2 rounds. The first missed, went high. The second penetrated the driver's hatch. The Panther brewed up. Tanker slang for catastrophic fire. The German tank burned with black smoke pouring from every opening. 3 down. Paulson's Sherman executed a 90-degree turn at full speed to engage a Panther on the right flank. This was extreme stress on the final drive housing. Sharp turn, full speed, frozen ground. The exact combination that had killed Sergeant Morrison and 46 other Sherman crews. The barbed wire held. The housing didn't crack. The Sherman completed its turn. Paulson fired, penetrated the Panther's side armor. The German tank exploded, 4 down. Between 0903 and 0905 hours, the remaining 5 Panthers tried to withdraw. Reverse out of their positions, escape before the American Shermans killed them all. But the Shermans had them surrounded. Panthers were faster in reverse than Shermans were moving forward. That was part of German tank design. But from defensive hull-down positions, the Panthers couldn't reverse quickly. Had to maneuver out of prepared positions, navigate around terrain. That maneuvering exposed their sides and rear. American Shermans converged from 3 directions. 5 Panthers destroyed in 90 seconds. 9 Panthers total, all destroyed or disabled. At 0909 hours, the engagement was over. 18 minutes from first shot to last. 9 German Panther tanks destroyed. 14 American Sherman tanks still operational. 0 American casualties. Task Force Hogan had broken through the German encirclement. The road south was open. Webb heard the victory report on the radio, sat down in the snow beside the maintenance truck. His hands stopped shaking. Sanchez appeared from somewhere and sat beside him. They held. Your barbed wire held. Webb nodded. Yeah, it held. Sanchez said, You saved 15 men. Webb watched the column of Shermans continue moving south. Just did what needed doing. Task Force Hogan reached American lines at 1400 hours on December 26th. 14 Shermans rolled into friendly territory. Webb examined the 3 barbed wire tanks immediately. Didn't wait for official inspection. Crawled under each Sherman with his flashlight. The barbed wire was still tight. The welds were still solid. The cracks in the final drive housings hadn't propagated at all, not even slightly. Compression reinforcement had worked exactly as designed. Physics had beaten Belgian winter. Word spread on December 27th. Tank crews from other units heard about the barbed wire repairs. About 3 Shermans that shouldn't have been mobile leading a breakout through 9 Panthers. Maintenance officers came to examine Webb's work. Captain Richards filed an official report. Webb never saw it, but Sanchez did. The report said, Private Webb's unauthorized repair method proved effective under combat conditions. Coming from Richards, that was the closest thing to an apology Webb would get. Major Garrett, the 3rd Armored Division maintenance officer, interviewed Webb on December 28th. Garrett was a career officer, academy graduate, engineer by training. He listened to Webb explain the repair procedure: barbed wire, 7 layers, compression reinforcement, 12 weld points per housing. When Webb finished, Garrett asked, "Why barbed wire?" Webb answered, "It was available. High tensile strength. Barbs prevent slippage. Same principle as barrel bands on old naval cannons." Garrett asked where Webb learned that. Webb said, "Tennessee, fixing tractors." On December 29th, Army engineers tested Webb's method under controlled conditions. They took 3 more Shermans with cracked final drive housings. Applied barbed wire wrapping exactly as Webb had described. Tested the tanks under combat simulation. Sharp turns, rough terrain, sustained high-speed operation. All 3 tanks performed normally. No crack propagation. Final drives held through everything the engineers could subject them to. On January 3, 1945, 3rd Armored Division issued Technical Bulletin 47-1945. Emergency field repair of final drive housing cracks. Webb's method was officially authorized as a field expedient repair. Required materials: high tensile wire, barbed wire acceptable, come-along tensioning device, welding equipment. Procedure time: 45 minutes per tank. Success rate in testing: 100%. Between January and March 1945, Webb's method saved 63 Sherman tanks in 3rd Armored Division alone. 63 tanks that would have been abandoned. 63 crews that kept fighting. The technical bulletin was distributed to all armored divisions in Europe. 4th Armored Division adopted it on January 10th. 7th Armored Division adopted it on January 15th. By February 1st, every American armored unit in the European theater knew Webb's barbed wire method. Conservative estimates said the method saved over 200 Sherman tanks that would have been abandoned due to final drive failures. Over 800 crew members survived because Webb wrapped barbed wire around cracked housings on Christmas Eve. Captain Richards dropped all charges against Webb on January 5th. Richards told him directly, "Can't court-martial a man for saving 800 lives." Webb received no medal, no commendation, no official recognition. The Army didn't officially acknowledge that he'd violated regulations. But tank crews knew. Word spread through the armored divisions. If your final drive cracked, find the mechanic who knew Webb's method. Wrap it in barbed wire. Keep fighting. On January 20th, 1945, Colonel Hogan personally promoted Webb to corporal. Hogan said, "You saved Task Force Hogan. You saved a lot of other units too. The Army needs more soldiers who fix problems instead of waiting for permission." Webb's response was the same thing he'd been saying since the beginning. Just did what needed doing, sir. Webb stayed with 3rd Armored Division through the rest of the war, fixed tanks, trained other mechanics in the barbed wire method. Never sought recognition, never talked about what he'd done. When people asked about the repairs, he always said the same thing. Learned it fixing tractors in Tennessee. Nothing special. After the war ended, the Army Engineer Corps studied Webb's method in 1946. They incorporated compression reinforcement principles into final drive housing redesign. The M26 Pershing tank used reinforced housings based partly on Webb's field expedient. Later Sherman variants received housing upgrades. The fundamental problem Webb had solved with barbed wire was eventually solved with proper engineering. But it took the Army 2 years to engineer what Webb had improvised in one night. Webb returned to Tennessee in 1946, went back to his father's garage in Crossville, fixed tractors, trucks, and farm equipment. Never talked much about the war. When people asked what he'd done in the Army, he said he was a mechanic with 3rd Armored Division. Didn't mention the barbed wire. Didn't mention 9 Panthers destroyed. Didn't mention 800 lives saved. Just said he fixed things. Sergeant Davis's Sherman, the first tank Webb repaired, survived the entire war. It ended the war in Czechoslovakia in May 1945. Still had barbed wire wrapped around its final drive housing. Tank crews called it Tennessee's tank in honor of the mechanic who'd saved it. The Sherman is now preserved at the United States Army Armor Museum at Fort Moore, Georgia. The barbed wire is still visible on the final drive housing. Still wrapped tight after 80 years. The plaque beside the tank reads, M4 Sherman, repaired in field by Private First Class Marcus Webb, using improvised methods. December 1944. Participated in 9 major engagements, 0 mechanical failures. Marcus Webb died in 1998 at 72 years old. His obituary in the Crossville, Tennessee newspaper said, Marcus Webb, local mechanic, World War II veteran. Didn't mention he'd saved 800 lives. Didn't mention he'd changed Army doctrine. Didn't mention he'd proven that sometimes the best solution is the one nobody's thought of yet. Just said he fixed things. Innovation doesn't require laboratories or engineering degrees. Sometimes it requires a 17-year-old kid who knows how to fix tractors, who sees a problem everyone else accepts as unsolvable, who refuses to let good men die for lack of trying, who wraps barbed wire around cast steel and says, "This'll work." And he's right. That Sherman at Fort Moore sits in the museum with barbed wire still wrapped around the final drive. Still tight after 80 years. Still proving that the best military innovation comes from the people closest to the problem. The mechanics who fix what's broken. The soldiers who refuse to accept impossible as an answer. The 17-year-olds who learned engineering by fixing tractors in Tennessee and applied it to saving lives in Belgium. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe to see more forgotten stories from World War II. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from Tennessee, Germany, Belgium, or somewhere else entirely? These stories matter. These men deserve to be remembered. Thank you for keeping their memories alive.